So, good morning once again, dear students, and we have here today the poem Daffodils written by William Wordsworth. But before we begin with the text of the poem, before we start understanding the poem, let us quickly have a look at the background of this poem and also a little bit about, let's know a little bit about the poet, that is William Wordsworth. So, here on your screen, you can see the inspiration for the poem Daffodils came from a walk which Wordsworth took with his sister Dorothy. You have just seen the portraits of both William Wordsworth as well as Dorothy Wordsworth in the beginning of this video. So they were taking a walk around Glencoyne Bay, Ullswater in the Lake District of England. He would draw on this to compose I wandered lonely as a cloud. Now, that is the first line of this poem, and initially, this poem was known by the first line itself. Later on, it was renamed Daffodils. Now, this poem was composed in 1804, inspired by Dorothy's journal entry describing the walk. Okay, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud is one of the most famous and the best loved poems written in English language. It was composed by the Romantic poet William Wordsworth around 1804, though he subsequently revised it. The final and the most familiar version of the poem was published in 1815. So it took him 11 years to publish this poem finally. The poem is based on one of Wordsworth's own walks in the countryside of England's Lake District. It's a very, very famous area of England. And during this walk, he and his sister encountered a long strip of daffodils. In the poem, these daffodils have a long lasting effect on the speaker. Firstly, in the immediate impression they make, and secondly, in the way that the image of these daffodils keep coming back to the speaker's mind later on. I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud is a quintessentially romantic poem bringing together key ideas about imagination, humanity, and the natural world. So, these are the three basic themes of the poem, you could say. One is poetic imagination, the other is humanity or the place of man in this realm of imagination or in this natural world. So now let's take a look at the text of the poem and let's try to understand stanza by stanza or line by line what this poem tries to tell us. So here on your screen you can see the poem Daffodils. So I'll just read out the text of the poem first and then we can have a line by line explanation, stanza wise explanation of this poem. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not be but gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, there flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So here you have an artist's illustration of the daffodil flower. It's golden yellow and it has a green stalk. And in the thumbnail of this video as well as in the beginning of this video also you must have seen I have provided you with the picture of the real daffodils as well as a clip art which shows the daffodil. So daffodil flower. So now let's try to understand stanza by stanza and line by line this wonderful beautiful romantic poem written by William Wordsworth. Here, the poet William Wordsworth says that I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills. So, the poet was taking a walk. And you have seen already in the introduction, I have given you enough notes in that you know that Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy, they were walking aimlessly, just enjoying the beauty of nature. And in the process of walking, they were passing across various landscapes, and different beautiful natural sights were visible to their eyes when suddenly they saw a vast expanse of blooming daffodils. Now, the poet makes use of a simile in the very first line of this stanza. He says, I wandered lonely as a cloud. That means I was wandering around, that means roaming about, lonely. Lonely means just as a cloud can be seen floating in the sky aimlessly and all by itself, the same way the poet says that he was wandering lonely as a cloud. Now, when you have a comparison using as or like, then such a comparison is called a simile. So he goes on to continue with that simile in the second line. He says that floats on high over vales and hills. So what does a cloud do? It floats in the sky. It floats over mountains, over landscapes, over valleys, over grasslands, over meadows. So just as the cloud does it, so also the poet was saying that without really having a specific destination to go to, he was just wandering, just like a lonely cloud. When all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. When suddenly appeared before his eyes a large or vast expanse of blooming daffodils. Now, these daffodils are wildflowers which grow in England, in the countryside. It's a common sight, especially during the season of spring. So, these daffodils, they are yellow in color and golden yellow to be precise, and they bloom naturally. They don't really have to be planted by anyone or taken care of by anyone. They are just wildflowers and they bloom naturally, and that's how these daffodils were blooming. And not one, not two, but thousands of these daffodils could be seen by the poet, blooming and lying ahead of him. Where were they? The location of the daffodils is explained in the next line. Beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. So these are the areas where these daffodils were blooming, just beside the lake. Maybe there was a lake in front of them as they were walking, and the daffodils are small flowers in small plants, wild plants which grow uh, naturally in the landscape, and they were blooming under the trees. So there were many big trees, and underneath these trees one could see fields of daffodils blooming by themselves, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. And because the breeze was blowing, what is a breeze? A breeze is a gentle movement of the wind. So the wind was blowing, and it seemed that the daffodils were swaying from side to side as if they were dancing. Now, here the daffodils have been personified, because dancing is something which is an attribute to a human being, because a human being can dance, but for flowers dancing, they were just swaying, moving from side to side. But the swaying movement of the flowers is compared to dancing, and that's how the poet seems to give human touch to these flowers. So that's what the first stanza. Now, in the second stanza, the poet continues. He says, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. So, just as now, here the poet in the second stanza, beginning the first line, the poet compares the fields full of daffodils, blooming daffodils, to the sky full of stars. So, when you see the beautiful night sky on a clear night, you get to see that there are thousands and thousands of stars shining in the night sky. And we know that is nothing but the Milky Way is nothing but the constellation of millions of stars and planets. So, in the same way, these daffodils could be seen filling up the landscape. So, the poet compares these daffodils to the sky full of stars. The poet then goes on to describe that these daffodils they stretched in never ending line, very simple, that as far as one could see, the daffodils were everywhere. As far as he could see, the narrator or the poet seemed to see these daffodils stretching in a line which never seemed to end. They were stretching far and wide. And where were they stretching? Along the margins of a bay. Bay refers to water body, generally the sea. So there was probably the seashore nearby, and these daffodils were blooming all along the shore of this bay. And 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. Once again personified, the daffodils are said to be tossing their heads, they are said to be dancing. Now, that is only possible for a human being or human beings to do, but these daffodils seem to be dancing and tossing their heads from side to side as they danced. And 10,000. Was it really 10,000? It could be more. The poet didn't count. The word 10,000 saw I, the phrase, or rather the sentence, or the line, actually indicates that there were thousands of these daffodils which were blooming and swaying in the breeze that was blowing, and it all seemed as though they were dancing happily, tossing their heads from side to side. Now, coming to the third stanza of the poem, the waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. The waves of the sea, as we know, if you have gone to the seashore, you must have seen this with your own eyes, that the waves keep on coming and crashing upon the shoreline and then receding. So the waves ebb and flow. They keep coming and going out, coming and going out into the sea once again. So they create a lot of foam and spray as they crash upon the shoreline. So the waves, if we consider that the waves were dancing, and then if we consider that the daffodils were also dancing, then the comparative judgment between the waves dancing and the daffodils dancing, one could easily come to the conclusion that the waves were perhaps not able to dance so very gleefully or joyfully as these daffodils were doing. So they outdid the sparkling waves in as far as their sprightly dance was concerned. A poet could not be but gay in such a jocund company. So the narrator says, or the speaker says, or being a poet, Wordsworth says that to see such a sight could definitely make a poet very, very happy. So there was no other option for a poet but to feel happy, to be in such a joyful, happy company of such beautiful flowers dancing in the breeze. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. I kept on looking. I stared and stared. I couldn't take my eyes off these beautiful dancing daffodils. They were so beautiful. And I did not have time to even think what wealth the show that I was seeing had actually brought to me, brought to my thoughts. At that point of time, the poet says he was not able to realize what wealth or what valuable or what precious memory is getting etched in his mind while he is watching these daffodils dancing before him. He will realize it only much later. As he is watching them now, he is not able to realize that, but he will realize it later. So that's the end of the third stanza of the poem. Now, coming to the fourth stanza, this is the last stanza of the poem. This is something which relates to what happened after the poet experienced the beautiful sight of the dancing daffodils while taking a walk in the open in the lap of nature. So, for oft when on my couch I lie, because very often when I lie down on my sofa at home, in my living room, in my drawing room, when I am all by myself, poets generally love to be by themselves. They prefer solitude, they prefer to be lonely or to be alone so that they can give thoughts, and they can have thoughts, and they can give expression to their poetry. So they think they often love to be alone. So for often when I am lying down on my couch in vacant or in pensive mood, my mood is either vacant, either I am not thinking about anything, or maybe I am very thoughtful, pensive. When I am in either of these moods and I am by myself, all by myself, they flash upon that inward eye. Inward eye, a person's imagination, a person's memory, which comes back to one as a flashback. So the inward eye. So there are three eyes, two eyes with which we look at the world outside, and the third one which is not visible, which is our inner eye, which is in our mind, which is in our heart, which is within us, by means of which we recollect the sight seen by us earlier. So they often come as flashback to me. The beautiful sight of the yellow daffodils. I am often reminded, in simpler terms, if we may explain this, I am often reminded of that beautiful sight of the daffodils. I see those daffodils in my inward eye. And then I that is what the bliss of solitude is all about, because that is the blessing of solitude. That is the blessing which solitude brings to a person. And my mind fills up with joy. I feel so happy, and I simply start dancing, not in reality, but in my thoughts, with those dancing daffodils. My mind, my thoughts, my imagination starts dancing, and I become very happy from within, because that is what the bliss of solitude is all about. That is how solitude works like a blessing on a person, because then you are able to recollect, and then you are able to feel happy thinking about those beautiful dancing daffodils, and that is what the poet says he experiences. So that's how the poem comes to an end.